everybody. Welcome to our final episode in our Upskilling Leaders and Managers podcast series. So today we're going to focus on the future of leadership, specifically with a BEDI lens, so belonging, equity, diversity and inclusion. And we're joined by some great guests again that were in our last episode, sort of further on that conversation and sort of do a punchy deep dive into some of this stuff. Tom and I, you hopefully know really well by this point, but let's just introduce some of our guest speakers. So if we can start with you, Sarah.
Of course, yeah. So I'm Sarah Hobbs. I'm the Managing Director of Talent and Potential. So my professional expertise is in the kind of space of talent management, career management. That's where I can spend a lot of my life. But I also have a very big interest in the subject because I also happen to be transgender as well.
Thank you. Nathan?
Hi, I'm Nathan Nalla, founder and director of BEDI Riot. My pronouns are he and him, and essentially I support organisations to build strategy around equity, diversity and inclusion. A lot of what I do is sort of delivering learning content and focusing on things like inclusive leadership, inclusive recruitment, inclusive behaviours within the workplace, but also supporting organisations on the journey of understanding the different challenges that might exist within their organisation.
Great, thank you very much. So if we sort of take a step back for a minute and just define some of the things we're talking about, I'll start with you, Nathan. What do we mean by an inclusive workplace, and what are the benefits to the individual and to the business?
Yeah, so I think at least for me and that BEDI Riot, we speak about an inclusive working environment as being one where people feel that they are part of something and at the same time also feel recognized as an individual. And so this is based on sort of some research that was done by A.E. Randall that sort of narrowed it down to essentially these different human needs that we all have. And I think sometimes the language around it is a bit fluffy. So sometimes you might hear people say things like, an environment where people are able to bring their whole selves to work. And that can look very different for different people. What does that actually mean? And sometimes even when we say belonging, it's like, well, how much do people want to feel that they belong at work? Sometimes people just want to turn up, do a really good job, and go home. And they don't necessarily want various aspects of their identity at the forefront. And so we focus on those two aspects. So essentially being part of something and also being recognized as an individual at the same time.
And I would say that really rings true for me. And I'm not a professional practitioner in this area in that sense, but that was on a personal level. That's really, those two things are really true. And I think I felt like for a long time I hid away who I was and kind of really lied a lot about who I was and didn't tell anyone. It kept really, really, really under the radar. And actually something about being able to just not do that and not hide anything that actually means that I'm so much happier and more successful in the work that I do as a result. So being on the receiving end of an inclusive culture is just it's an amazing thing. And I really would encourage anyone who's thinking about doing work in this area to really focus on it.
Any thoughts from you, Tom?
You mentioned...
Go for it.
So you mentioned the benefits, right? The benefits.
Yeah.
And so there are so many. If we talk about, sometimes you hear the business case around diversity and inclusion. And I actually recently sort of made a conscious decision that I don't want to speak about the business case too much anymore. For two reasons. I think one, the first reason is that the moral case, the fact that actually it's just right. It's just right that we create work environments where people are able to thrive and people are comfortable, and there's no sort of one aspect of a person's identity or background that prevents them from progressing or thriving in the workplace. Equality, fairness. I think that in itself is enough of a reason. But if people are looking for that business case, then there are studies after study after study and bits of research that have been done that link diverse working environment to innovation, to being better at sort of succeeding in new markets, to avoiding sort of sort of real mistakes and pitfalls in regards to cultural sensitivity. And then the inclusive environment really linking to sort of collaboration and innovation. And I'm sure Sarah is very aware of this as well through the work that she does, but retention as well, and the fact that people tend to work better in teams where there is an inclusive environment.
Can I be annoying and jump in and actually just ask a question rather than offering a thought? Mention there about businesses looking to the business case or the fact that it's right, and I agree that I think it's right, and that a social conscience should exist within every business. So when a business does the right thing, builds a diverse culture for the wrong reasons, i.e. just the business case, do you, and it's open to everyone, do you think that works? Because I don't know. It's not my field of expertise, and I've not seen enough cultures to really know. But do you think you could create a genuinely diverse and inclusive culture for the wrong reasons at the heart of it?
It's an interesting question.
And does it matter? I guess if you've got the diverse culture, does the intent matter at the end of the day?
I think what I've seen is that the business case is often used as a sort of way to get buy-in, right? A way to get the decision makers to say, actually, yes, we are going to commit to some degree, we're going to commit to prioritizing this work. And so the work in itself, I think, is going to be good if it's done with, I imagine that beyond that, there is a desire to see equality, fairness, and inclusion within the workplace. I'm not really sure. Other than if organizations were to approach things in a way that was sort of more of a tick box exercise, rather than actually digging deep into some of the real challenges within their organization. So I guess to give an example, Pride Month is sort of coming to an end now. But we're seeing, every year we see organizations across the world change their logos to the rainbow logo. And, for a lot of organizations, this is just now a marketing ploy. It's just, a chance to kind of, avoid any sort of, I guess, backlash if people do say, well, look at that organization, they don't even have a rainbow flag during Pride. But then also, what are you doing internally? How do your LGBTQ plus employees actually feel at work? And what are you doing to support them if they are facing challenges? Do you have any LGBTQ plus employees, or are they being, discriminated against at the door? Right? What about your consumers? What about your service users? How are you supporting the lives of LGBTQ plus people on the ground? And so there is a way to approach this work in sort of tick box way. So I would say that yes, that is a problem because it doesn't necessarily get to the real sort of core of the issues. But I think oftentimes what I've seen is that the business case is used to kind of persuade leadership to perhaps give people some budget or prioritize something that previously they weren't seeing as a business priority, essentially.
And I guess it plays to the kind of broader issue around leadership is, because you could ask the same question about leadership. You could almost say, well, if someone is doing the things they're supposed to do as a leader, with no authenticity, but they're doing them because that's what they feel they need to do, are they going to get some kind of response? And yes, they are from some people, obviously. Some people are going to but actually, did those people really care about it enough to start with? I think, from my perspective, I think you can usually tell whether someone actually genuinely believes this and is genuinely being authentic about what they're saying and following. And actually, I think, a lot of the things that make the biggest difference are not things that you can put in a tick box list anyway. Your tick list would have to have things like, I care about people. I actually will stand up for and champion issues, and I will if someone is, if there's a conflict situation, I will support someone who's being given a hard time and made to feel like they don't belong. And I think those things are very difficult to do if you're just doing them as a tick box exercise. I think you really genuinely have to believe in them and want to support them, because actually it's so much easier in some ways just to walk on by. And so I think yeah, I just think I think people will see straight through it if that's purely your agenda. Yeah, and in the past we've done things like putting policies in place, and I think creating a kind of an environment where the basics are taken care of. I think you can do that without really caring about it, at all. But actually, I think your organisation, particularly kind of millennial age group people, are becoming much cuter to that, and actually kind of realising when it's not really something that the organisation means and don't believe in it. I think you're almost in some ways, and I think Nathan's point around pride is really interesting. I think you're better off kind of if you're not really into it, just not saying anything, and actually just having the policies in place and doing that, rather than kind of you see some organisations making an absolute kind of song and dance about their support of it, and then you hear other stories about how things are not so warm in that organisation towards some of these groups, and I think that almost is worse, really. So yeah.
Thank you, both. That was really interesting.
It's just one aspect of EDI, right? And
absolutely.
That what we've been describing is described as rainbow washing or pride washing, pink washing. And we see a lot of organisations doing that, but it's not only around pride. We see it during Black History Month, for example, or we see it during International Women's Day, where all of the organisations are talking. But then how does that conversation actually translate into, let's say, reducing the gender pay gap within your organisation? How does it translate into actually addressing the ethnicity pay gap in your organisation? And some of the issues around attracting talent as well. And so something that I've become aware of, and Sarah touched on this, so younger generations, I don't know if millennials are young. Yes, I'm a millennial and I'm not.
I know, right? I don't feel it anymore. That's gone.
I'm here to say that.
I feel so old now.
And so, I came across a government sponsorship the other day that was actually for young entrepreneurs, and it stops at 30, and so technically I'm not young anymore, according to the government. So anyway, we are finding that in the interview room, people are asking some of these more challenging questions. So they'll ask organisations, so what is it that you're doing towards diversity and inclusion? What is it that your organisation is doing around the environment? And if you don't have a good enough answer to that, then that might impact whether that individual decides to work for your organisation or not. So even at the very point of wanting to attract the best talent, I can't remember the exact statistics, but people are starting to take this a lot more seriously in terms of deciding which organisation they want to work for.
Yeah. And it does extend outside, doesn't it? Even to the point where the other day I was being in a conversation with some younger people who were really beautiful, I would say that, but who were really kind of very, very focused on the environment and were berating organisations for greenwashing. And kind of like trying to champion that cause, but actually not really meaning it. And I do think people are absolutely seeing through this stuff now. I think it's the world has become slightly more sceptical, and people are challenging and questioning a lot more than they once did.
Isn't that a wonderful thing? Maybe I'm in the minority to think that, but I think it's such a fantastic thing. For so long we've kind of thought, critical thought and doubting what you hear until you have proof. But I think it will be painful for the next decade, I think, as organisations have to go, we have to do what we say we're going to do. This is new. But then, once we get past that point, the workplace will be better, but actually society will benefit from it.
Yeah.
For the first time, we're seeing people hold organisations accountable, which we've historically not been very good at as a kind of populace as human beings. So I think it's quite an exciting time in that regard.
It is, but and Nathan probably would be able to talk to this even more than me, and probably even dare I say it, name names, but actually also there are organisations out there who are amazing and who absolutely believe and walk every mile of they absolutely do what they say they're going to do, and it's very easy to kind of be sceptical and kind of almost like organisations have to catch up on it, and lots of them do. But actually, there really are organisations out there who absolutely care about all this stuff and are doing everything they possibly can. You think it's off topic, but with the environment, it's a massive issue. And so actually sometimes you can understand people feel like, and same with diversity, it's kind of feel like what I'm doing is a drop in the ocean, but actually that drop is as important. And we really can't think like, oh, we're only one part of the whole. We really need to kind of see that actually that really does drive the whole machine. And so I think those, we should be calling out those organisations who really are amazing at this stuff and really do it incredibly well and are passionately believing in it and following it at every level and part of their organisation, and the leaders who are absolutely kind of driving that need to be recognised for that capability. It's just such a shame in some ways because often it's a good thing, but it happens in award ceremonies and things like that. But actually, that almost misses the thousands and thousands of people who actually are doing that stuff, and they need to be recognised. I absolutely know for myself when I kind of came out and began my transition, there really were some amazingly good organisations who were just incredible, and just the level of support was amazing. And there were some that weren't so good, and you kind of think actually you can really see that, and a huge respect for the ones that walked the talk on that.
I read a quote this morning, and I'm going to destroy it a little bit here from my memory, but it was something to do with one of the roles of a leader is recognising the power of harnessing collective uniqueness in people, be that creativity, diversity, whatever it is that you see in your business, and kind of bring out the best of that and the richness of that, which is great if some leaders, if that resonates and that's part of their agenda. But when we look to the future of leadership in championing BEDI, what are we looking to see? What kind of conversations need to be had in businesses? What is the role of the leader here?
Yeah, for me, it's really interesting because actually, like being, having kind of characteristics that fall into those kind of diversity kind of lists. Actually, I say it really regularly, but it's the least interesting thing about me, really. And actually, what's really interesting actually is knowing what my strengths are, what my capabilities are, what it is I'm really good at, what I bring to the party, and almost kind of really understanding that in kind of each of your team members, and helping them feel like they belong based on kind of who they are as a person, rather than which kind of box they tick and which category they fall in. Actually, is really important. It's almost like we're always going to have to champion groups. There's always going to be prejudice. There's always going to be issues on it. So we're always going to have to probably champion this stuff. But actually, as leaders, kind of I think that kind of uniqueness is really important. But understanding that actually, there's so many more things that contribute towards that uniqueness, and taking the time to really understand that in people. You could be kind of, white middle-aged people get a really hard time, but actually there's a uniqueness to what people bring from that perspective as well. And I think it's kind of bringing all of those things together, which I think is a really significant role of a leader. But around the kind of diversity agenda, for me, it's about kind of understanding that some people are going to be struggling more than others because they're facing things that the others don't have to face, and helping them with that. But actually, seeing uniqueness is for everyone in the team, I think.
Nathan, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a big question, really. I think during the time that I've been doing this work, I think maybe I've been on a journey myself in kind of recognizing how broad diversity is and the various different challenges that exist within diversity. So often we focus, in doing this work, we like to focus on 5 sort of key areas. So we talk about gender equality, LGBTQ+ identities, race and ethnicity, social mobility, and also accessibility. And these aren't new issues in the workplace, they're not new issues in society, right? And they're issues that have existed for decades, if not decades, centuries. We've seen discrimination based on these different things. And they're sort of embedded in the way that our society works. And so, of course, that then translates into the workplace and the ways of working. So I think one of the places where I like to start when having these conversations is actually just a recognition that this is big, and actually anything that you are going to do isn't necessarily going to change things overnight. There is going to be a need to continually learn and to continually sort of work towards creating what an inclusive environment looks like for various different people. So there are organizations that I've worked with who, very much want a concrete sort of 6-month plan, and then by the end of the 6 months we'll be done, this will be ticked off, this will no longer be a priority. And the reality is, no, this is about culture, and it's about maintaining a certain type of culture. And actually, as a leader, recognizing that the culture shift might mean making certain sacrifices in terms of the ways of working. And I think we've talked a bit about environment, and I think that's actually a really good example where people tend to get it. Like, if your organization, its business model was built on dumping plastic into the ocean, then you know that you have to change that business model, right? There's some restructuring that needs to be done in order to get better results. And so it's a similar thing with diversity, equity, and inclusion. If your organization, since its conception, hasn't hired women at the same rate as it's hired men, going beyond, pipeline issues or, specific sector challenges, we know that that's a challenge that needs to be addressed. And how do we address that? Well, we address that by looking at the ways that you recruit. And actually changing the ways that you recruit are likely to change some of those outcomes. And so leaders need to be willing to do that work, right? They need to be willing to look at the ways of working and challenge those things, try new ways of working, take risks in order to get those results, and continue to do that, continue to learn, and continue to apply that sort of trial and error approach to this work.
Tom?
Cool. Even after listening and going, oh yes, that's very insightful, I now have to say something that makes some form of sense, don't we? I think, look, the biggest thing that I guess I'm very aware of at the moment is two things. One, the fact that leaders, I think, or many leaders, are scared to do anything in case they do the wrong thing. So first of all, you're going to do the wrong thing, so just do something. You are going to make a mistake, and that's okay. I think there is a fear around that. But when you look back, when I was sort of reading, I did reading before coming here today, but probably not useful reading. As far back as feudal Japan, there was this thing about the best rope is made of many different twines, each one different and imperfect alone, but together perfect. And I sort of thought, that far back, at a conceptual level, we kind of got this, that bringing difference together makes a better whole. So this isn't a totally new concept, we just need to breathe life into it as opposed to having it as a concept. But what we don't want to do, which I think is sometimes it's an attractive concept, is to tear it all down and start from scratch. Because that is, well, first of all, it's incredibly destructive to an existing business, but also that's not going to get the people who don't agree, that is not going to bring them to the party. That is going to make them disagree with you more, run further away, and make reconciliation harder. Because I'd love to say, yeah, everyone's going to agree and everything's going to be perfect, but we all kind of know that's not where we're at as a society, as workplaces right now. So we've got to be willing to make mistakes and, to a certain extent, tread with purpose, but not deliberately damage things around us. We don't need to break stuff to make things better. We can take time to consider things before acting, rather than just running at the latest, new, loudest thing, which is very popular maybe, but not always necessarily the right move right now for your organisation and your people. Very, very tricky. And I don't envy people going through this at all.
I think it's a really important point to make, right? It's actually wanting to be very measured in the approaches that you take. And so some of what we were speaking about in the previous conversation was about how we actually foster those conversations with the people within our organizations to understand the specific challenges that they face, and then what is it that we can do to respond to those challenges. So whether that's creating those sort of focus groups, what people might describe as safe spaces, where people can give sort of that anonymous feedback alongside other people that may have, a similar experience to them or identify in a similar way to them, actually can be very insightful, because there is so much to this that it means that oftentimes what we do see is that organizations are sort of throwing various different things at the wall and hoping that it sticks, right? And not necessarily addressing the specific challenges that might exist within your organization, based in your location, based on, your surroundings, the demographic, your industry, your sector, all of the specifics that are really important to focus on. But I do want to pick on one thing that you did say, Tom, around the people that don't necessarily agree. And I think it's an interesting point, and maybe you can elaborate more on what it is that people are disagreeing with. But I think that as an organization, it is vital to have a very sort of clear stance when it comes to aspects around inclusion, equity, diversity. And there are always going to be people who, for whatever reason, don't understand it, don't get it, or are ignorant, or, they have their own biases, right? And they have their own prejudices. I'm not on their side.
No.
And I'm not on their side because I, as a Black person, as a person from a less privileged social economic background, as a person who's also gay, I've been in the workplace and experienced things that I should never have had to experience at work, right? If I walk out on the street and someone says something to me, then fair enough, it's in a public place, don't want to have those experiences, but it's quite different to being somewhere in a working environment where I should be protected from those experiences. And so I think we just have to, I guess, be quite careful where we're saying, if people don't necessarily agree, we're being clear about what it is that they don't agree with. And we're taking a firm stance and saying, as an organization, here are our values, here's what we believe, and here's what's not acceptable. And if you don't align with this, then you're at the wrong organization.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. I think it's one of the recordings we haven't released yet. I kind of made the point of you can't train someone out of being a racist. I'd love if I could make a piece of eLearning and fix the world in that way, but it doesn't work. If someone is of a certain set of beliefs, the right response is actually to say, there's the door. You're absolutely right. I think what we do have to be cognizant of, though, is there are a more detailed day-to-day functioning within the business level. Everyone's not going to agree about, for instance, putting the business doing a pride flag. For instance, if a business chooses not to do it, does that make them a bad business? There may be people within the business that say, yes, this makes us inherently not doing the right thing. There may, however, be other people in the business that say, hey, look, I'm fully on board with the messaging, but for whatever reason, we don't feel it's the right thing for us to do, whether it's because it will come across as insincere, because we know there are problems in the business that we're trying to fix, or whatever it might be. So I think it's just being willing to have a conversation and say, there are some absolutes, absolutely. Some things are completely unacceptable in modern society, let alone the workplace. But there are also areas for discussion about how they're implemented. And you're not going to walk into the room and say, okay, so here's the C-suite, everyone is going to agree from day one. There's going to have to be discussion about how you implement and change a business. And that's more what I meant. No, I absolutely wouldn't suggest that you tolerate some kind of intolerance within your business to go, oh, well, they'll come around eventually. They've kind of had long enough at this point. I think the they'll come around stage is 50, 60, maybe a couple of 100 years in the past at this point. We're at a stage where businesses shouldn't be afraid to say, hey, look, if you can't get on board with this fairly basic level of kind of everyone here is a human, you will treat them with respect, then well, you shouldn't have a job full stop. Those are the people that should be, sorry, it's pretty harsh, but sidelined to society. Sorry, this is why Tom doesn't do politics in public very often. I'll go get my red flag in a minute and start running around outside. That's...
That kind of leads me on to... Oh, sorry, Nathan. Go on.
No, I was just going to quickly say that I think, there are still, it's sad, but there are still organizations who defend some behaviors that you would think are just completely indefensible. And I've come across those organizations. And then the other thing I would say is actually firing someone might be the piece of learning, right? We're talking about learning and upskilling. That might be the piece of learning that they actually need in order to really reflect on their behaviors and their perspectives.
Yeah,
you'd certainly hope so.
Yeah, that can make a real statement about your culture, right? About what it means to work there and how you sort of support people and what isn't acceptable. Is that by sometimes taking those sort of severe decisions that are just right for that business and the people. What I was going to sort of take us to finally, and throw this one at you, Sarah, if you don't mind, is one of the thoughts that came out of the CIPD Festival of Work for me was about unconscious bias training for leaders. And there was a quote that said, we need to move away from unconscious bias to conscious inclusion, which I quite liked and I've been thinking over. What's your thoughts on unconscious bias training? Does it work? Does it still have a place? You know, what are your perception of how valuable that is of actually addressing bias in the workforce?
So I think it's an important point to raise. And I'm in the space, right, of what's labeled as diversity training. And we do talk about unconscious bias in pretty much all of the content that we deliver. We do include conversations about unconscious bias. Where I start, I think, is that organizations need to set the right expectations when delivering learning content in general. And so all of the research around unconscious bias essentially tells us that it comes from society. And right from the minute we're born up until, into our adult years, we're constantly being bombarded with certain messages based on gender, based on race, based on disability, and so on, that create these associations within us. And so, in reality, a 2-hour workshop isn't going to undo all of those years of unconscious biases that have been formed in our brains, right? And so I think what the science does say is that in order to address some of those associations, we have to essentially put ourselves in situations where we're seeing sort of the opposite of that belief, right? The opposite of the stereotype. Or, if you have negative associations towards a certain group of people, then the best remedy to that is actually building relationships with people who are part of that group, right? And so that's what the science tells us, and so that's what we should expect in terms of creating change. It's difficult for organizations to, I guess, manufacture an environment like that, because, of course, it's down to the individual really to engage and want for that change to happen for themselves. But what is helpful, as the CIPD have pointed out, is focusing on what you can change. So your conscious inclusion. So at BEDI, Riot, we talk about inclusive behaviors. What are the very sort of specific practical things that you can do as an individual to create that sense of inclusion around you? And then, of course, hopefully, as an individual, you also want to challenge your own unconscious biases in the decisions that you make in your personal life and outside of work. But that's kind of what I'd say there, right? Sorry, Tom, it looks like you had a point to share there.
I was just going to say that was so nice to hear from someone else. Me and Gemma have spoken about this in the past on previous episodes in the office, that it's one of those topics that frustrates me because I've seen so much e-learning pushed out about getting rid of unconscious bias and a whole learning campaigns around destroying unconscious bias, because it's like, you can't, it's not how it works. We're promising something you can't possibly deliver, and then wondering why the business says this stuff is nonsense and we're not going to fund it inside the business anymore. And I feel like it's an area where we've done a lot of well-meaning damage to actually our credibility as L&D in the space. where, as you say, all the science tells us exactly what we can and can't realistically achieve. So I think it's a great approach to here that I think is actually going to have a really positive impact and start to recoup some of that lost time and credibility in the space.
Well, the point I'm making isn't to say we shouldn't talk about it, right? There is something valuable in raising awareness, because oftentimes what we do as humans is we say, "Oh, I'm a really good person. I would never, have a negative bias towards someone based on their sexual orientation. I would never have a negative bias towards someone based on their ethnicity." And that, unfortunately, just isn't true, right? We do have these different associations and biases. And so, if anything, the awareness piece is helpful because it then gives us an opportunity to reflect on our own perceptions and our own behaviours, and then move to that place of conscious inclusion, do something about those behaviours, start doing things differently.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to get your thoughts, Sarah, on sort of hybrid workers, that I guess sort of the risk or the challenge that a lot of businesses are having is this sort of two-tier workforce of treating people differently. We talked in the last episode about 2 different cultures. What do you think are some kind of practical things that leaders can do around addressing that to make sure that they're giving the same opportunities, the same access to promotions and development and effort to people that are seen and perhaps not seen within their teams and business?
I'm really sorry, I only got half of that. You were going in and out throughout that question.
Sorry, it was just about this sort of challenge of the 2-tier workforce in businesses. So leaders potentially have got people they're managing in the office and out, and that can lead to things like promoting people that they see or treating people different, not giving as much time. How, some practical things of leaders providing a sort of equitable experience across the board and making everyone feel as included.
Okay. I think for me it kind of goes back to what I was saying before, really. That I think it's something about, as a leader, taking time to understand what those particular needs are. I think it's about taking time to understand each of the people you've got and what it is actually that, we talk about kind of, and rightly so, we talk about kind of reasonable adjustments and making things easy for, legally for particular groups. But actually, I wonder whether there's a more general principle there as a manager and as a leader that kind of says, actually, I need to really understand what each person in my team, what will get the best out of them, and actually do I adjust accordingly. But I think from a career perspective, if I kind of fall back on where what's really important from a career perspective, the 2 things really that make the most massive difference to people are, from all of our research, are things like reputation and visibility. And I think actually visibility in particular, I think is hard when you're working on a hybrid basis. So I think making sure that as a manager, you and as a leader, you kind of get people to that the right people are in the right meetings, that actually you're encouraging them to speak up and to participate, and that where you have an opportunity to kind of champion your people, that you're actually doing that with other more senior leaders that you're kind of connected to, so that actually people they're gaining that kind of visibility. And I think from that applies to kind of all of your team members. I think you should be doing that. But where people are particularly maybe struggling as a result of a particular kind of maybe they're kind of because they're not viewed in the right way because of their sexuality or their race or kind of whatever, then actually offering that, just making 100% sure you are absolutely doing that and offering that support, building that confidence, I think is actually really, really helpful thing you can do. But I think just anything you can do to champion people in your team to get their visibility right is really helpful. But also, I think if you know what it is they're really good at and what it is they love doing, then actually helping them, making sure that work that kind of fits that kind of the type of person they are actually gets pushed towards them, because ultimately that's what's going to help them build their reputation and within the organisation. And if those 2 things are working together with the visibility and the reputation, ultimately, I think they will start to see that success.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you, Nathan and Tom, as well. It's been a really insightful discussion. Thanks so much, guys.